So many of our stories are preoccupied with blood. As a substance, sure, but also as an agent, an active participant with its own story to tell. And our obsession with blood is readily apparent from a quick search on Netflix. We love blood. The 2012 book Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn and its subsequent movie in 2014 directed by David Fincher is in conversation with all of these stories, and it actually depends on them in order to exploit our expectation and spin a satisfying narrative. The Blood in Gone Girl is its own agent, infused with the power to accuse and condemn. Amy, the titular Gone Girl, makes sure of this. And apologies if you're unfamiliar with Gone Girl because it has one of the greatest plot reveals in history. But yeah, Amy did it. About halfway through the story, it's revealed that Amy orchestrates her disappearance as a way to punish her husband, Nick. The centerpiece of her grand plan? Blood. Lots of blood. Amy juxtaposes herself against a slew of other stories with missing women. She mentions Ellen Abbott, a popular true crime show in the story, saying, "I love how protective and maternal she gets about all these missing women on her show, and how rabid dog vicious she is once she seizes on a suspect, usually the husband." Amy sets up her audience, us as her readers in a metafictional sense, but more so the police officers within the story that are investigating her disappearance. She exploits our narrative expectations. It's always the husband. And the ending result is downright Shakespearean. See, Shakespeare also exploited this obsession, which was already well established in early modern England. He had his own bloodthirsty audience, and while Gone Girl isn't a direct retelling of Shakespeare's work, it's definitely informed by them, particularly The Taming of the Shrew and Macbeth, with explicit callbacks to both plays. And the performative nature of blood in Gone Girl directly ties into the process of early modern adjudication. One convention that Shakespeare's audience would have been familiar with was cruentation. Cruentation was a medieval method of finding proof against a suspected murderer. The common belief was that the body of the victim would spontaneously bleed in the presence of the murderer. A good example of this is in the anonymous play Arden of Faversham. In the play, the main character, Alice, murders her husband, and when she's confronted with the corpse, she declares, "Arden, sweet husband, what shall I say? The more I sound his name, the more he bleeds. This blood condemns me, and in gushing forth speaks as it falls and asks me why I did it." Blood equals proof, giving blood the ultimate credibility. In an article detailing cruentation in early modern literature, Professor Leslie Dawson explains that this process was seen as a vital form of evidence in early modern Europe, noting that blood functions repeatedly in early modern texts as the means through which the murderer recognizes and acknowledges his or her guilt. Of course, Dawson also warns against making too strong of a link between medical theory and literary representation, but this muddying of reality and fiction gets right to the heart of the matter. Which brings me to Macbeth. While cruentation is not directly at play in Macbeth, Lady Macbeth's hallucination mimics this process in that she can't stop King Duncan's blood from haunting her until she gives her quasi-confession. The performance of this scene allows the audience to contemplate blood as more than just a way to identify guilt, but as an active agent in defining what it means to be guilty. It blurs the lines between criminal justice and theatric catharsis. This is especially true of productions that cover Lady Macbeth in tangible blood, such as this production from the Folger Theatre. In visualizing blood that is meant to be hypothetical, a hallucination, Lady Macbeth incriminates her audience along with herself. In her essay analyzing blood as a physical prop, Elizabeth Dutton notes, "Just as the bearing of blood on hands or clothes can be a sign of guilt, so also the seeing of blood can be the sign of a guilty conscience. Lady Macbeth is guilty because she can see the blood. And we can too." But this idea of blood offering ocular proofs is also meant to be a tool. In both Macbeth and Gone Girl, there are multiple audiences whose sympathies are at stake. Lady Macbeth must convince her husband's constituents of both their innocence and their ability to rule, while Amy must convince the police, and later us as readers, of Nick's guilt, or at least of her innocence. And both of them do this through the use of blood. When Lady Macbeth says, "The sleeping and the dead are but as pictures, 'tis the eye of childhood that fears a painted devil. If he do bleed, I'll gild the faces of the grooms withal, for it must seem their guilt," she both uses blood as a prop in her fabrication of King Duncan's murder, as well as affords blood the power to condemn. Amy similarly uses blood to fabricate a murder. When Amy reveals to the audience the full extent of her neurosis, she tells us, "I sat cross-legged on my kitchen floor for 10 minutes, letting the blood drizzle steadily until I'd made a nice thick puddle. Then I cleaned it up, as poorly as Nick would have done after he bashed my head in." Here she brings the audience into her conspiracy, giving us a backstage pass to see how she works the system. She recognizes blood as having the ultimate power of credibility, drawing on a cultural faith in forensics and true crime documentaries, and she fabricates an entire murder around it. This passage is doubly performative in that Amy is clearly addressing an abstract audience in the second half of the book. While the diary's audience is the police, the passage where Amy speaks to us as readers indicates either a metafictional awareness or a deep-seated need to perform. In either reading, her dependence on blood is absolute and points to a shared phenomenon in both texts: the need for closure. Lady Macbeth offers the audience and other characters closure, confessing her crimes and punishing herself, where Amy only offers closure to us as readers. And through Detective Boney, we can see the implications that a lack of closure entails. It's its own type of madness. And the question of madness is pivotal to both Lady Macbeth and Amy. In either character, there's a question as to the extent and the duration of their madness. Is Lady Macbeth crazy throughout the narrative, or only in her final scene? Is Amy a sociopath or a victim? And while it's super tempting to psychoanalyze fictional characters, I'm more interested in the effects of their performance. Much of Gone Girl's narrative is reliant on the power of performance and a receptive audience. The characters operate in a world where a history of visual confirmation being conflated as proof, as in Macbeth, is well established. Amy, completely aware of that paradigm, uses it as a tool to fabricate her own murder. She uses blood as a performance prop in two important scenes, both taking place in the first half of the story. First, when she establishes a fear of blood, and again here where she postures Nick as a potentially abusive husband. And while the second scene doesn't directly reference blood, the broken Judy handle covered in Amy's blood later in the story provides closure for this narrative Amy's pushing. And so she takes a page out of Macbeth and implicates her audience in her own delusions. And we as readers, although we may be skeptical of Amy's sincerity, have no choice but to be taken along for the ride. Part of that ride is a detailed exploration of self-punishment, even if Amy wouldn't use that term. Each of these women are self-punishing in their stories, allowing their blood and their victims' blood to act as props in their picture of justice. In her essay on stage blood, scholar Lucy Monroe writes, "The very theatricality of the use of the bloodied and fragmented body also raises important questions about its emotional impact and its effect on a spectator's understanding of the staged body's ontological status. When a limb is amputated, the detached body part enters a disturbingly liminal state somewhere between subject and object status. In theatrical terms, it also blurs the distinction between object and actor." Andrew Sofer asks, "If anything can become a prop, does this necessarily mean that anything can become a prop? What of the human body itself?" And this gets at what Julia Kristeva calls the abject, the place where identity breaks down and meaning collapses. Monroe's superimposition of Kristeva's abject on the early modern stage and its use of blood signals an important tool in identifying the particular brand of horror at play in both Gone Girl and Macbeth. See, Amy serves as a source of abjection throughout the novel, casting herself as both subject and object in her own drama. When she slashes her arm to spill blood on the floor, and when she self-mutilates her genitals to perform the role of rape victim, Amy casts herself as a prop. And this second act is Amy's way to cover up her real murder of Desi. And since death is the ultimate transformation from subject to object, Amy becomes a source of abjection that then creates more abject parts. In Kristeva's essay on abjection, she states, "Any crime, because it draws attention to the fragility of the law, is abject. But premeditated crime, cunning murder, hypocritical revenge are even more so because they heighten the display of such fragility." And Amy is intuitively aware of this. In the second half of the novel, where she is at least seemingly candid with the reader, she says, "I've always thought I could commit the perfect murder. People who get caught because they don't have patience. They refuse to plan." And this is maybe the critical difference between Lady Macbeth and Amy, and why Lady Macbeth dies and Amy wins. Each of these women sees their journey as one towards justice, or at least getting what they deserve, whether that be a political appointment or the perfect marriage. Blood becomes their tool of choice in that journey, creating a feedback loop of images across seemingly disparate fictions. Of course, Gone Girl is acutely aware of this relationship to early modern texts. The narrative is dependent on its replication of early modern marriage dynamics where divorce wasn't an option. The narrative neatly sidesteps this convention by building a toxic competitiveness into Amy's character. She can't get a divorce because she sees it as losing. All of that's to say that Gone Girl doesn't replicate these early modern images by coincidence, as if they've unconsciously seeped into a cultural memory, but it should be more understood as a modern retelling of these stories. And so the question really is, why are we as an audience so hungry to consume this rebranded iteration of a familiar trope? When Gone Girl first came out in 2012, it was #1 on the New York Times fiction bestseller list for 8 weeks, and its movie counterpart grossed $369.3 million, making it one of the most profitable movies of 2014. Plus, even today, every new domestic crime novel is marketed as the new Gone Girl, which it never is. Please stop saying this. But what's interesting to me is that with the removal of over 400 years, the characters in these stories are still playing the same game. The key difference with Gone Girl is that Amy has a clear understanding of an audience's need for closure. And lucky for us, she wants to provide it as much as we want to receive it. This is seen center stage when she concludes the novel, literally cutting off Nick's final chapter to say, "I don't have anything else to add. I just wanted to make sure I had the last word. I think I've earned that." Yeah, she did. Macbeth begins a tradition of blood as a source of closure, and Amy capitalizes on that established need. It fuels multiple plot lines in Shakespearean plays, is at the core of every true crime show, and speaks to a morbid curiosity that flows throughout our society. We want to see blood, and we want it to tell a story.